Hello, everybody. So, today we're going to talk about changing the living world. We're going to talk about using selective breeding and what it is. And we're also going to talk about how people increase genetic variation in the population. So, one question as we're going to talk about selective breeding, and I want to know is what are some examples of what organisms people breed? So, what are different animals or plants that people breed? I don't know if you came up with anything, so I'm going to wait for a second or two. Think in your head. What about things like crop plants? And I'm thinking an example more like corn, tomatoes, pumpkins. I love going to some of the fairs, including Topsfield Fair and the Big E, and sometimes you see the largest pumpkin that you can have ever grown, and there's a competition for those. And the same way, people breed dogs, horses. Some people breed some plants like roses, things like that. So this leads to what is selective breeding? That's the question that we're going to kind of discuss a little bit here. We see some lovely, lovely dogs all sitting around, and they're all very different. Now, these dogs are all the same species, meaning they're all part of the dog species, but they're very different in what they look like. And really, what selective breeding is that humans are breeding these organisms based on really desired traits. I don't see one of these here, but one of my favorite types of dogs are the collies. Those are the dogs that you usually see that herd sheep and other livestock. If you had a collie as a pet, you would take it for a walk. A lot of times the collie would try to herd you because that's a trait that was breeded into them, and it gets passed on. It's a little bit in their genetics. So what are some of the characteristics, do you think, looking at this photo, a dog breeder would selectively breed for? Do you think some dog breeders are looking for the strong muscle tone in some of these dogs? Do you think the dog breeder is looking for the ability to smell certain scents or be able to catch animals if it goes hunting in the water? All of those are really great examples of what breeders are using. They take advantage of naturally occurring genetic radiation and they try to put it into the next generation. Now, one thing that I like to talk about, and this is kind of what we're going to be talking about also in the next chapter, is that some selective breeding is an example of biotechnology. So write that word right there, biotechnology. Biotechnology is kind of a relatively new field of biology. And when I say, sorry about that. When I say relatively new, I mean it's something that kind of has been big since the 1970s and it's been increasing in its usage in today. Basically, it's using technological process, inventions, and other ways to apply it to living organisms and use that to help also choose and control the breeding of organisms. Before we get to biotechnology, let's talk about selective breeding in plants. And the reason why I want to do selective breeding in plants is because one thing I always point out to my students is the word clone, and you probably heard this of cloning, making another copy, actually comes back to meaning twig. Twig. And the reason why it means twig is because farmers have been doing selective breeding way before biotechnology came about. And that's what I want to show here. Corn is one of the first examples of selective breeding, where humans try to improve a living organism for our benefit. We know that corn was domesticated by the Native Americans about 6,000 years ago. Okay? And basically, when you look at what the Native Americans were looking at, they saw this plant right here, the teosinte. The teosinte, as you can tell, see how it has the little seeds kind of up like that? That looks nothing like what we see today for corn. But it was a wild grass. It was native to Mexico, and they bred it to eventually become what we now know today as maize or corn. So just looking at this, do you see differences between the plants? Hopefully you see that the seeds of the maize is much more of them, and they're more compact compared to the ones in the teosinte shown here. You also see the difference between the green kernels and the yellow kernels. So how did we get from here to here? What was the process? Basically, what happened was humans took advantage of maybe some small traits and variations in the teosinte, bred them, so that they eventually pass those traits to the next generation and eventually come over there to what we now know as maize. One thing to pay attention of, very important to kind of understand, is that this is a long process. It occurs over many, many generations. So this doesn't happen overnight. It was something that took a long time. And we're still changing how our corn is today through selective breeding, adding in maybe a little biotechnology. Some things we try to do is we're adding more sugar to our corn because it makes it sweeter. Another thing it might, and we don't add it by just like throwing in sugar, but by taking really, really sweet corn breeds and breeding them with other ones to hopefully increase the sweetness overall. Now, how we sit there and get selective breeding is we're going to use both hybridization and inbreeding. So what's hybridization? Hybridization was first kind of discussed and talked about by, well, it's been done for a while, but one example, great example, is Luther Burbank. What he did is he crossed plants to produce desirable, what he called hybrids. And basically what those are is like a kind of a mixture of plants. Here is one of the example of one of his hybrids, this potato. This probably looks really familiar, but this potato was developed using that Burbank's methods. Basically, Burbank was able to develop more than 800 varieties of plants, and a lot of them were resistant to some diseases or and were utilized for our food breeding. Now, inbreeding is what we see a lot of in maintaining some types of animals and plants and stuff like that. But we do this also with like dog breeds, and we do that also with horses. Basically, is you're breeding purebreds with each other. And you're ensuring that you're not mixing with any other genetically different organisms. So you're increasing the chance that the cross between the two individuals will bring together some desirable recessive alleles for a trait. Unfortunately, what happens is sometimes that leads to an unhealthy stock. We now know that a lot of the inbreeding that's done with dogs, if you look at some of the species today, they have been so modified that they might have a lot of diseases associated with them. So how can breeders increase genetic variation? Well, the biggest way to increase genetic variation that we would see with breeders is by mating with other organisms or things outside the gene pool. So that's opposite of inbreeding. Inbreeding, you're going to maintain the stock and you kind of keep everybody within the same gene pool. If you mate outside the gene pool, that really helps to increase genetic variation. Another thing we can do, and this is examples shown here, is kind of looking at other ways scientists have done it, is mutations. Now, in bacteria, we can do this really, really well. We don't do it often in other organisms, but basically what you can do is you can induce mutations through radiation or chemicals. And again, this is done really well with bacteria because it's a simpler organism. What's interesting is, and I don't know if you guys have seen the documentary or heard about it, there was a nuclear plant explosion called Chernobyl, and there's a lot of radiation there. Scientists have been able to go back to the site of the explosion and investigate the animals there. And what they've found is like spiders that make webs there do it not the way they're supposed to. So if you're familiar with like, a spider web kind of has that nice shape associated with it, something like that. Usually we kind of think of spider webs really well done. Theirs has holes in it. They're gaping. So we definitely see that there's a mutation that occurred that caused a genetic variation. They're thriving, these organisms, but there's definitely something there that has changed in the DNA. Insects also, same thing. We're seeing, instead of ladybugs that normally would have, maybe 3 spots on each side, you're going to see maybe like 1 spot or misplaced spots or something like that. So we do see that radiation chemicals can cause mutations, and that's a way to add variation into the population. In plants can do something called polyploidy. What polyploidy means is increase the number of sets of chromosomes. So, for example, in humans, we have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs. Okay? In a polyploidy, you would not have 23 pairs. You might, instead of pairs, you might have like 23 times 3 amount. So we usually have like 23 times 2 to get 46. We'd have 23 times 3, which would be 69 chromosomes, and that's not what we have. Some plants can do that. They can have a change in their chromosome numbers, and that's what's shown here, their ploidy level. So again, what humans have is like a 2N amount, but some plants, like a banana, can have a 3N amount, so you can see that they change the number of chromosomes, and that again adds a lot of genetic variation. Here, something like a sugar cane, that's what gives us sugar, has 8N. That means it's like many more sets of chromosomes compared to what even humans have. Like the cotton and peanut has twice as many sets than what normal organisms usually have. And again, this adds a lot of new species. It gives us a lot of variation and changes compared to the original. The big thing I want to point out is this only occurs in plants. That's the big thing I really want to point out here, is because plants can do this really well. Any other organisms, they really have a hard time doing it, and it usually is not viable, or it doesn't live if it has more than 2N or 2 sets of chromosomes. So hopefully you're able to understand a couple things, like how does hybridization improve plants? How does inbreeding used to maintain some breeds? And maybe be able to explain a little bit what biotechnology is. I really hope you'll be able to explain a little bit what that is, because we're going to go a little deeper on this one coming up.